All right, so as you can see, we are now going into Daniel chapter 6. Now, as I explained before, the parentheses, the numbers in the parentheses, that gives you the Christian verse numbering, and the Jewish verse numbering not in parentheses. So, and that includes the Tree of Life version. That, well, David Stern's Complete Jewish Bible, that has both, actually. So, but just so you can follow along, if you have a Christian translation, then pay attention to the numbering in the parentheses. So, from conspiracy to lion's den. From conspiracy to lion's den. Daniel chapter 6. Now, most of us are familiar with the term Lion of Judah. And we know that that refers to Yeshua. We know that, that in the book of Revelation, he's referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. This happens to be, I believe this is a picture from one of the Chronicles of Narnia movies. And of course, what is the name of this lion? Aslan. And who does Aslan represent in real life? Right, Yeshua. Just as the Lion of the tribe of Judah refers to Yeshua as well. So the most important lion in the scriptures by far. However, the focus today is going to be on different lions. And this is supposed to be Daniel here. I have a few different pictures. I like these pictures. You know, just a man like you and me, unless you're a woman, who's standing there in front of these vicious, ferocious lions. And you would think that that's an uncomfortable place to be, but you can see that he's not really fazed by this. He's just kind of standing there and even wanting to make friends with these lions. But the lions' mouths are stopped. They, you know, when Daniel gets in there. So, you know, that's a spoiler alert, by the way. So if you haven't read Daniel chapter 6, or if you never paid attention in your Sunday school or Shabbat school, then you're not aware of this story. But most of you have probably heard this story. I didn't grow up in a religious home at all, and so I really didn't know about this story until I became a believer at age 17. But it's a very famous story, but there's much more to the story than what you'll hear in a children's class. Here's another picture here, Daniel in the lion's den. And yet another one. So I like all these pictures, so I want to get them in. So, a quick review. We're going to just backtrack just a little bit into Rob territory in chapter 5. Just a little bit to review so we can have a nice transition into chapter 6. The handwriting on the wall. Now, this is, of course, during the Babylonian Empire. And as we get into chapter 6, we're transitioning into the Medo-Persian Empire. So we're still in chapter 5 in the Babylonian Empire. Belshazzar, who may be one of the grandsons of Nebuchadnezzar, he is kind of the focus here. So we'll just to briefly cover these verses here. Belshazzar and his father reigned over Babylon. So they kind of co-reigned here. There were, but the focus here is on Belshazzar, the younger. Belshazzar, if you'll recall, and I know Rob made this clear, Belshazzar exalted himself over the God of heaven, over the God of Israel. What did he do? Well, remember that Nebuchadnezzar, when he went in and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, he took artifacts, vessels from the temple, which included cups and bowls and so forth, and utensils. But he kept it more as a museum items. You know, he didn't use them. He didn't abuse them, Nebuchadnezzar. But Belshazzar, his final act of arrogance against God, the one true God, was to take those vessels and to use them for one of his celebrations, one of his banquets that he held. And so that was considered kind of the last straw as far as the Lord was concerned. So a hand from God appeared and wrote these words. And you can read that, right? Even you Hebrew students, right? Especially you Hebrew students. Well, it's ancient Persian script there. But you can see the small print at the bottom there. Actually, each of these represents it represents a monetary value. And so, for instance, the tekel is kind of comparable to the shekel in Hebrew, and then the parrots at the end there is really more of a half shekel, hence the connotation of divided. But we'll see that. Just to point out there, that last one, parrots, it has, all of these have a double meaning. It's a word play for all of these. But this one here is a double word play. And we'll see that in a moment. Parrots. And it's a tzadi sound on the end of that. So most of the time, we've seen this in translations, and you've probably heard it, mini, tekel, ufarsin, or something to that effect. You can see in the Hebrew that's not quite correct. So it's mene, tekel, ufarsin. And you can see that's a better transliteration there of it. Now, just as a question here, chapters 5 and 6 are still written in what language? Right. It's not in Hebrew. So chapters 2 through 7, most of chapter 2 through chapter 7, written in Aramaic. And here we go in verse 26. This is the interpretation of the inscription. This is the interpretation that Daniel gave to the king. Now, when the king saw this handwriting on the wall, he was petrified, but he didn't understand what it was. And so he calls in Daniel at the advice of his mother. And so Daniel comes in, and he interprets it for it. It's not good news for Belshazzar. So he says, God has numbered, on Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Parrots, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Okay, so divided. So the Babylonian Empire has been divided up to the Medes and the Persians. And again, there's this double word play. All of it has a monetary value, each of these words, but again, the half shekel for parrots, hence divided. But also, those of you who know some Hebrew, parrots, it's not only a name, but it has the meaning. Well, how would you best define that word, parrots? What is that? Breakthrough, that's good. Breach. Breach is the term there. Now think about what's happening at the very time that Daniel is interpreting this for Belshazzar. Darius, the Mede, is coming in. He's breaching the secure defenses. He's kind of bypassing actually the walls. He's not actually breaking it down, but he's bypassing the defenses. He's coming in through the Euphrates River, and just kind of a comedy of errors on the part of Babylon, but he gets in. He breaches the defenses. So, again, there's that double word play there, as we see that parrots or parrots. Okay, verse 29, then at Belshazzar's command, Belshazzar, we'll go with Belshazzar. They clothed Daniel with purple, but a chain of gold put a chain of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation about him that he would have the authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Now, who were the first two rulers? It was Belshazzar and his father. So they were co-rulers. And now, because Belshazzar made this offer to Daniel, if you can interpret the dream, you can be the third person in a kind of a triunity there of ruling over the Babylonian Empire. Daniel said, I don't want anything to do with that. And yet they went ahead, because he interpreted the dream, they went ahead and they did it anyway. So Belshazzar, he makes him the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, how long did this sharing of the kingdom last? Daniel's put in this top position in the empire, and how long did he hold that position? Maybe a few hours, maybe just a few minutes, who knows? But it didn't last long because, again, Darius, he had breached the defenses. His forces are already in Babylon. And if we read on in verse 30, on that very night, King Belshazzar of the Chaldeans was slain. So God did not waste any time in taking him out, taking down the Babylonian Empire, and now it's going to be the Medo-Persian Empire. And so in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, so Darius, the Mede, not the Persian, but the Mede, took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So the question is, who is Darius, besides being a Mede? Well, there's a number of different possibilities, and quite frankly, the answer is we're not sure. So here's a couple of the possibilities, but it gives you an idea, an important idea of who he is. But it could be a title, because there are 5 future rulers by that same name. And his name means holder of the scepter. So again, that kind of suggests that perhaps it's a title. Ugbaru is one of the possibilities, and through certain historical sources, it suggests that on October 12th, 539 BCE, he enters with his army, he enters Babylon on the same night that Belshazzar held his feast, and where he was bringing out the utensils from the temple. So he's breaching those defenses, and he's coming in through the Euphrates River, because the Euphrates River comes right through the city of Babylon. Cyrus enters Babylon, according to some of the same sources. Cyrus enters Babylon triumphantly just 2.5 weeks later, October 29th, 539 BCE, and appoints Ugbaru, who may be Darius, to rule Babylon. Now, again, we don't know, but this is just some of the possibilities here. Because we have a Cyrus, we have a Darius, and Cyrus is identified as a Persian, Darius is identified as a Mede, and according to the sources, Cyrus actually placed Darius in charge at that point. So on to verse 2, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the whole kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. Isn't that remarkable? Daniel is he's somewhere in his 80s, maybe mid-80s at this point. You'd think, he might be thinking about retirement at this point, and he was kind of retired by the Babylonians until he was brought back by Belshazzar. But here he is. It's just remarkable that Daniel was appointed one of these 3 top administrators for the empire. And again, 120 satraps to rule throughout the whole kingdom. Those 3 administrators were go-betweens between the 120 satraps and Cyrus, or Darius, I'm sorry. So what is a satrap, and what was Daniel's job? Well, we're not really sure. The satrap, is some kind of a governor or administrator, but he's over these provinces. Now, were they appointed from within the provinces, or were they just answering to Darius the king? We're not sure. We know that they do answer to Darius, but they answer through those three top administrators, and one of those is Daniel. What makes it remarkable is that the Persians, they were enemies of the Babylonians. Of course, they just took the city of Babylon and really the entire kingdom. Yet Daniel, even though he was at the top of the administration in Babylon, he was still appointed at the top for the Medo-Persian Empire as well. It says something about him, and we'll look at that as we go. So, by the way, we want to relate this a little bit to the story of Esther, because Esther, and the events of the book of Esther take place a couple generations later, and the king at that time was Ahasuerus. And how many provinces were there? 26. What was it? 126. You missed it just by one. It's in Esther chapter 1, verse 1, so you can't miss it. It's 127. So 127 provinces, and here's the proof because it's on the PowerPoint. So, but it's interesting, 120 satraps at this point in the book of Daniel, and add maybe 7 more. And within a couple generations, but it's a close number there. So in verse 4, now this Daniel was distinguishing himself among the supervisors and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit in him. In fact, the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Pretty remarkable. But it says that he had an extraordinary spirit about him. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. So in verse 5, at this time, the supervisors and the satraps tried to find ground for a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. Why would they do that? Jealousy, perhaps. He was going to be elevated above all of them. But they were unable to find fault or corruption because he was trustworthy and no negligence or dishonesty could be found in him. Finally, these men said, "We're not going to find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless we find something against him regarding the law of his God." Now, that's the kind of person that we want to be, right? Whatever job we have, whether it's our secular jobs, whether it's our responsibilities at a congregation like this, or whatever responsibilities we have, this is what we want. We want to have that reputation that Daniel had. I had a friend of mine that just passed away right about the time that my father passed away, which was only about 5 months ago. And this man, his name is Paul Paradis, and he was one of my bosses when I was in the Navy, and we worked on weapon systems. And we had quite a revival in the ship, and he was one of the first that came to faith. And so, he, over the years, he would credit me, for bringing him to faith, and talking to his son. I was like the greatest person ever to live, and I'm thinking, who is that person they're talking about? Honestly. And then I listened to one of his sermons, and he happened to mention me in there, and he says, oh, the ideal he was just the ideal employee, so to speak. He was a supervisor over me at the time. And I'm thinking, that's not my memory. I wasn't so perfect, in the military, but that was his perception, and what a blessing, what a blessing that at least I projected that for some reason. Maybe they just saw the Lord in me, and overlooked the rest of it. But but that's the kind of reputation that we really want, and sometimes just having the love of the Lord and just having the Spirit of the Lord in you, it might be amazing just how many little things are overlooked in your life. So that just kind of blew me away, because that was very recently. I had lost touch with him. I think I mentioned he became a pastor back east, and so I just happened to listen to the first sermon I listened to. I was in it. So, but Daniel, he probably not only had the perception of being trustworthy and honest and all of that, but he really was, probably through and through. I mean, he had that kind of persona about him, and it's said that he had an extraordinary spirit in him. So God is the one, that's the most important thing anyway. It's what God thinks of us, and this is God's view of Daniel. So looking at just some of the yellow text here, an extraordinary spirit. Now, when I think of that, one of the first persons that I think of is Yochanan the Immerser. So Yochanan the Immerser, remember, he came in the spirit and the power of Elijah or Eliyahu. So what does that mean? To come in the spirit of means that he was empowered in the ministry of Eliyahu. So if a person has an extraordinary spirit like Daniel, it means that God empowered him for the job that he was doing. And of course, he was a great administrator and leader. We don't even know all the details of what he did, but God empowered him for that. And that's something that all of us should be seeking as well. That God would empower us spiritually in our jobs so that we can do our jobs better and perhaps even find a new job. If God empowers us to be good in one area, then you might want to find a job that's compatible with how God is gifting you. But he was going to be set over the entire kingdom, which is just remarkable. No fault or corruption found in him, trustworthy, no negligence, no dishonesty, amazing. But we are going to we're going to try to find fault, maybe not with him, but with his worship of this God. Maybe we can find a way to trip up Daniel regarding the laws that he follows in worshiping his God. Some of the others, by the way, Joseph and Mordecai. Joseph, of course, was lifted up to the highest position in Egypt. He was an administrator. Mordecai, again, same kind of thing. Now Mordecai was part of the narrative in the book of Esther, and this comes a couple generations later. But Mordecai was, at the end, he was lifted up to the highest position under the king. And so, it seems like the Jewish people in scriptures, they get to number 2 frequently. At least that's outside of Israel. Daniel, this is verse 5. But they were unable to find fault or corruption because he was trustworthy. Okay, we read that. Now, this should remind us of 1 Timothy, for instance, chapter 3, verse 2, an overseer. These are the qualifications for an overseer within the congregations of Messiah. An overseer must be beyond criticism. The husband of one wife, clear-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine, not violent but gentle, peaceable, free from the love of money. He must have a good reputation with those outside. So what does that mean, outside? That means outside of the community of Messiah. So even having a good reputation outside. And of course, that's what's being described with Daniel as well. So much so that they really had to dig to try to find something. They still couldn't, and then they end up slandering him and entrapping him. So it has to be a good reputation with those outside of the community of Messiah, so that he will not fall into disgrace and the devil's trap. Now, I like the use of the term devil there because, you know, in the Greek they're very close to Spanish from what I understand, diabolos. So diabolos is the Greek, and what it means is slanderous, accusing falsely. Exactly what was happening against Daniel. They were trying to slander him and falsely accuse him. And so they were doing the devil's bidding, so to speak. So it's important what those terms mean. You know, diabolos or devil, meaning slander and accusing. And of course, you know, that's something that we can expect. You know, Yeshua warned us about that as well, that that's going to happen to us. Blessed are those. So it's part of God's plan. That's the remarkable thing. It's part of God's plan that there's a devil, there's a part of God's plan where people do the bidding of the devil, and that there is slander, that there's character assassination, that there's false accusations. That's part of God's plan, and it's a hard part to understand. And maybe we'll never understand it until the world to come. What does the term Satan mean, by the way? Adversary, right, so coming against. That's why Yeshua referred to Peter. He says, you know, get behind me, Satan, ha-Satan. He's talking to Peter. You know, now that doesn't mean that Peter was demon-possessed, by the way. What it means was that Peter was taking a stance with Yeshua. He was going to not let Yeshua go into Jerusalem. He was being an adversary, without intending to be, of course. He was being an adversary to Yeshua and trying to stop him from from the most important part of Yeshua's life and role in his life. Verse 7. So these supervisors and satraps went into the king as a group. So this is now a conspiracy is starting, and we're going to see this. We're going to see the wording over and over and over that indicates a conspiracy against Daniel. They went in as a group and said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the supervisors of the realm, the magistrates and the satraps, ministers and governors, have all agreed. Well, how can they all agree? It's a conspiracy. They've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man for 30 days other than you, O king, will be cast into the lion's den. Now, notice before that it says, you know, O king, live forever. You know, that's an indication that there's a certain divinity to the king, at least in the perception of the people of the kingdom. And we see that in Egypt. You know, the Pharaoh was considered to be, to have some divinity about him. We even see that in the Roman emperors, you know, that they were considered to be, to have some divinity about them. So that's a little bit of this. But then you can see, you know, the people can only pray to you, O king, and even petition you, O king, nobody else, no other gods for 30 days. That should take care of Daniel, right? And in a sense, it does. If a person disobeys this decree, they'll be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it may not be altered, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Thereupon King Darius issued the written decree. So here we see a little bit of a difference, a big difference, between the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire. Because in the Babylonian Empire, the emperor, Nebuchadnezzar for instance, he had complete authority. You know, he could make a decree, he could revoke the decree, he could change the decree, he could do pretty much whatever he wanted. But in the Medo-Persian Empire, there were stricter laws. We see that in the book of Esther as well. So once a decree is made by the emperor, he cannot change it. He cannot himself change it. So he sealed it, and it's done. Cannot be repealed. Now we see this in the book of Esther. Remember, that was a major part of the plot, was that the evil I'm giving you a chance here. The evil Haman, okay, he devised a plan. He convinced the king, Ahasuerus, to do a decree against the Jewish people. And he slandered them and said, you know, that they're not obeying our laws, they have their own laws, and nothing could have been further from the truth in terms of being a problem within the Medo-Persian Empire. But the king issues this decree that's going to, in effect, annihilate the Jewish people. Now, that was a huge problem because in the Medo-Persian Empire, you can't revoke that. And so you remember Esther, and this is the part that, you know, we see dramatized. Esther goes in before the king. She's not allowed by law to go in before the king at when court is in session. She can't go in unless she's invited. So if she goes in uninvited, contrary to the law, the only way she could be spared her life was if the king extends his scepter. In other words, receives her willingly. So she has her friends and the Jewish people in Shushan there, has them fasting for 3 days, and she fasts for 3 days with her people. And then she's willing to go in. If I perish, I perish. She's willing to risk her life for that. So, you know, it was very dramatized. She goes in. Ahasuerus extends the scepter. And so what does she do? She exposes Haman. Thank you. A little bit quicker. And you'll drown out, you know, because we're supposed to, yeah, we're supposed to wipe out his name. So, okay, but what's the problem here? The problem is, even though she's exposed Haman, the decree is still, Haman, even though I'll just refer to him as the bad guy. So even though he's exposed and he's put to death by the king, there's still this decree, and it's throughout the kingdom, and it's going to cause the annihilation of the Jewish people. So the king doesn't do anything about that. He doesn't seem to even give it a second thought. So what we don't usually pay attention to in the narrative, unless you're reading through the whole story every year, which I encourage you to do, Esther had to go in a second time. She had to risk her life a second time. Now, even the text doesn't dramatize it as much, but it says that she went in before the king a second time, and he extends the scepter. So she's received. And now she explains to the king, we got to do something about this, you know, because the Jewish people are going to be annihilated unless you do something. And so the king couldn't change his decree, but he could make another decree that would kind of nullify the first one. So in other words, he allowed the Jewish people to be armed and to defend themselves, which they did successfully throughout the kingdom. So that's how that got resolved there. Well, we're going to find, as we get into the story here, Darius, he's kind of forced by his own decree to send Daniel into the lion's den, and before he sends him in, he spends the entire night trying to figure out a way to get around this. But he couldn't. Now, the Lord had a plan. It was a lot different than anybody else would have suspected, and we're not really going to get into that until next week. But you know, the Lord had His plans, even when it looks the most bleak, like there's no answer, like the enemy has won. And yet the Lord, He steps in and He glorifies Himself in the process as well, because He wants people to come to Him. So, Darius issued the written decree. So the lion's den, you know, we kind of take it for granted because we've heard the narrative so many times, but the lion's den is very cruel. You know, just like, of course, you know, back with Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, using their Babylonian names, they were sent to this fiery furnace. And, you know, so again, there's these cruel means of execution, and the lion's den is one of them. And what's the intention of that? You know, why would they choose something so cruel? It was to instill fear in other people. It was to instill fear so that others would not disobey the decrees of the king or the laws of the Medo-Persians. The Romans did the same thing. You know, they had cruel, very cruel methods of punishment. Of course, the cross was one of them. They used lions as well. They didn't, not so much the lion's den, but they even had them in the arenas so that there could be a public spectacle when people were being executed. So just a cruelty, but again, the intent behind it was to keep other people in line. So this bad guy, we already talked about this, that he convinces Ahasuerus to issue a decree as well that could not be revoked. And Esther risks her life 2 times going in before the king on 2 separate occasions. Now, verse 11 in Daniel. Now, when Daniel learned that a written decree had been issued, he went into the house where the windows in the upper room opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he knelt down, prayed, and gave thanks before his God. Now remember, this is written in Aramaic, and so it's referring to Daniel and his God, just as he did before. So even though this decree has been made by King Darius, Daniel doesn't change a thing. It really doesn't tell us what his mental and emotional state is at this point. It doesn't tell us in the text, but we kind of get hints here because just as he did before, doesn't stop him at all. He is going to pray to God in the same way that he always does. Then these men came as a group, again, the conspiracy, they came as a group and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So they caught him doing something that was contrary to the decree issued by Darius. So they approached the king and spoke to him, again, acting on behalf of Diabolos, about the royal decree. Didn't you issue a written decree that anyone who prays to any god or man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Didn't you say that? Didn't you issue that? Didn't you put your signet ring on that decree? When that happens, you know, just to personalize that in our own lives, when things like that happen, when people do slander us, maybe we even, you know, we lose a job over some false accusations. Can God use those circumstances in your life? You know, and that's one of the main lessons that we should get from this text here. Even if it's a conspiracy against you, not just one person, but a whole group of people, you know, God can use that. God can turn it to good. And we have to trust him to do that. One of the things we're going to talk about, though, is why was he facing Jerusalem? You can always count on the PowerPoint to ask the right questions. Why face Jerusalem? Jerusalem is in ruins at this point. The temple is destroyed. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So why is he facing Jerusalem? Today, do we have a temple in Jerusalem? The Orthodox and the conservative, and many in the Messianic community as well, face Jerusalem for certain prayers. And we'll see why. So which direction, by the way? When Daniel, he had a window that was facing Jerusalem. He would pray 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem. Which direction was he faced? Yeah, because so many times we just assume it's always east. No, he was on the east side. He was facing west, and probably about 200 miles away from Jerusalem is where he was. So he couldn't see it, by the way. He couldn't see Jerusalem. He was just facing towards Jerusalem. Now, Solomon's prayer. This is where we get the instruction to face Jerusalem. Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the first temple, and we have 2 main records here of his prayer. His prayer. If you haven't read his prayer, read it. It's so inspiring. 2 Chronicles chapter 6, 1 Kings chapter 8. And this is worth reading because this is what Daniel had in mind, and the content of Solomon's prayer is so important and so relevant to what he was praying and what he's going to be praying in future chapters within Daniel as well. So this is from, and by the way, just to give you a little picture here, this isn't an accurate picture of the first temple, and certainly, the first temple was in ruins anyway. It kind of looks like a kind of an amalgamation between the first and the second temple, and then a little imagination added to that. But this is an actual photo of Solomon. It's hard to see, from where you're at, I know, but. All right, 2 Chronicles 6, verse 20. Solomon, he's talking to God. He's praying to God at this point during the dedication of the temple. What happened after his prayer? The glory of God descended on the temple, filled the temple so much that the priests could not even enter in order to minister within the temple. So great was the presence of God at that point. But Solomon, he's praying here that your eyes may be open toward this house. Notice the wording here. Toward this house, day and night, toward the place where you have said you would put your name there. To listen to the prayer, that's the important thing too. God puts his name and his reputation into this temple. To listen to the prayer which your servant will pray toward this place. Toward this place. Notice the repetition here over and over. Hear the supplication of your servant and your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from your dwelling place, from heaven. So it's not saying that God is, yes, his manifest presence is there, but Solomon is recognizing that God, his dwelling place, his throne, it's in heaven. And hear from heaven, hear from your dwelling place in heaven. And when you hear, forgive. So Solomon is anticipating times when Israel is going to need forgiveness from God. If your people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against you, yet when they return and confess your name, praying and making supplication before you in this house, then hear from heaven, forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them back to the land which you gave them and to their fathers. So, in other words, this is a prayer from exile. Doesn't mean that all prayers towards Jerusalem, towards the temple, have to be from exile. But he's anticipating this. Solomon is anticipating the time when Israel is going to be exiled from the land, and he's asking God, when they pray towards this place as an act of repentance, as a show of faith in God, that you would hear and answer and forgive. So praying towards Jerusalem is an act of faith in God, not just some ritual. So let's know, this text here lets us know what Daniel was praying when he would pray 3 times a day. And the interesting thing is that it's the Amidah, the standing, now it's known as the Shemoni Esrei, probably was in a rather different form in the time of Daniel, but Daniel was praying 3 times a day, and the content of his prayer really is the content of the daily Amidah even to this day, even though the wording may not be the same. So toward this house, again, it's repeated at least 3 times, but slightly different wording. But when they're exiled, forgive and bring them back to the land from exile. And of course, Daniel was in that time. Israel was exiled at that time. The temple was destroyed along with it, along with the exile. But again, emphasizing the same content is in the Amidah prayer today, which is prayed 3 times a day. Now, I mentioned Orthodox only. What do I mean by that? There's an Amidah for conservative and Reformed as well, but only the Orthodox have retained the full traditional meaning and text of the Amidah. And the importance of that is that other branches of Judaism, which are less likely to take the scriptures at its word, they don't, most branches of Judaism aren't looking for a restoration of Israel anymore. They're not looking for the Messiah anymore. And so I encourage you, if you're going to get a copy of the Amidah, do it through an Orthodox Siddur or a Messianic Siddur that retains the Messiah and retains the idea of the restoration of Israel in those prayers. Verse 32. This is skipping ahead in Solomon's prayer here, because this is important as well. Moreover, concerning the foreigner. Now, I put it in Hebrew here that it's talking about the Nochri, not the Gerim. The Gerim were those who fully assimilated into Israel. They're there in most cases to stay and assimilate, and to put it in modern terms, they converted. They assimilate into the community, and they can marry within the community now. But the Nochri are not. They're just temporary residents or just people passing through. Non-Jewish people just passing through, or maybe they're there on business, or usually it's business. But they could be there at the temple, just visiting the temple, because God has revealed himself to them as well. So it's the Nochri here that he's talking about. So, concerning the Nochri, who is not of your people Israel, but comes from a distant land for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when they come and pray toward this temple, then may you hear from heaven, your dwelling place, and do whatever the foreigner, the Nochri, asks of you. Then all the people of the earth will acknowledge your name and revere you as your people Israel do. And you remember, the temple was always intended to be a house of prayer for everybody. Now, you've probably heard that there's a court of the Gentiles. So the Gentiles can't get in quite as close as the Jewish people, and there's a reason for that, because presumably the non-Jewish person is not going to be trained and knowledgeable in all of the requirements. They haven't had the teachings from the priests who were responsible for teaching the people and how you approach God. So that's the only reason for that. And of course, through Yeshua, that's the, we don't have that issue, so to speak. So 2 Chronicles 6:37, when they have had a change of heart in the land, again, this is the Jewish people. This is even more explicit in terms of the, praying from the diaspora. When they have a change of heart in the land where they have been held captive, and they repent and seek you in the land of their captivity, saying, and notice the text here. The text, a lot of this text is borrowed from the Jewish community for the prayers at Yom Kippur. We have sinned, we have committed iniquity. And these words, we say with the beating of the chest at each one of these. We have sinned, we have committed iniquity, we have acted wickedly. Our sound people are going crazy because I'm making noises with the mic. And they return to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their captivity. So a full repentance, a full return from their hearts, with all of their hearts and souls, from the land of their captivity where they have been taken captive, and they pray toward their land. Now notice the progression here. They pray toward their land. I have to find my place there. I'm reading from a distance here. Where they've been taken captive, and they pray toward their land which you gave to their fathers, and the city which you have chosen, so now it's the city which you have chosen, and toward the house which I have built for your name. Then may you hear from heaven, your dwelling place, their prayer and their petitions, and uphold their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Now this is Solomon. This is Solomon anticipating all this, but this is in the book of Daniel. The content, the implication is Daniel is praying this kind of content on behalf of the Jewish people. And we'll see that later in a later chapter as well. But notice the progression there. If they pray towards this land, if they pray towards this city, if they pray towards this house. So the focus just narrows down to the temple. So what's the orientation in synagogues today for prayer? The orientation today is the ark is usually, the ark containing the Torah scroll, or Torah scrolls usually, is in a location in the synagogue so that when you're facing it, that you're somewhat oriented towards Jerusalem. Well, I say somewhat because it's not possible that everybody in the congregation is going to be able to face the Torah scroll and be situated towards Jerusalem. I actually had somebody give me a, I don't know what you would call it. It was a compass. And you wear this compass and it always tells you which direction is Jerusalem. I thought that was a really one of my favorite gifts ever. So anyway, the synagogues usually try to accommodate this, the direction that you would be facing for prayer. And sometimes though, if you're not even sure where Jerusalem is, you face the scroll as a representation of Jerusalem. And of course, if the scroll is being taken around the congregation like it was last week, we always face the scroll. That's part of the protocol. Purposes for praying while facing the temple. Again, we saw this in Solomon's prayer. Here we see that Daniel was praying 3 times a day, just as the Amidah is prayed 3 times a day. The Shema, by the way, is not. The Shema, the full Shema, is only prayed in the morning and in the evening services. And in the afternoon, you do an abbreviated Shema. So it's only in the Amidah 3 times a day. But it's to confess the sins of the community. So you're not just confessing your own sins, you're confessing sins on behalf of the community. And that's what Daniel was so effective at. To repent from the land of our captivity. And again, I mentioned this, we've taken the diaspora, the exile, for granted so much that we forget that we're still in exile. The return from captivity never happened in fullness, even during the time of Messiah, when Yeshua was here. But we have the promise that when he comes again, that he is going to gather his people from the four winds of the earth and bring them back to the land. So back to Daniel, the text here, and we'll finish this off. This is chapter 6, verse 13. So they approached the king and spoke to him about the royal decree. Didn't we issue a written decree that anyone who prays to any god or man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king replied, the decree stands according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repeated. So, the king confirms it. Yes, I did. I sealed this decree, and it cannot be repealed. And then in verse 14, then they answered and said to the king, Daniel is the one, he's one of the exiles from Judah, and he pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. In other words, he prays to God 3 times a day. When the king heard this report, he set his mind on how he might rescue Daniel. Whoa. So Darius obviously knows something about Daniel. Well, he put him at the highest position. This is the Darius who wanted to put Daniel over the entire empire. He knows Daniel's reputation. He knows the kind of person that Daniel is, even with all of these conspirators coming against him. So the initial reaction of the king is, I got to find a way around this. I got to find a way to save Daniel. Then these men came as a throng into the king and said to the king, remember, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or edict which the king issues may be altered. So they know from a legal standpoint they've got the king. There's no way around this for the king to fix it. So the king gave the order, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the lion's den. Now the king spoke to Daniel, saying, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought to block the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed regarding Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. He seems to be having this Nebuchadnezzar experience, remember? Nebuchadnezzar, he kind of came to terms on a couple of different occasions, acknowledging God, that he really is the one true God. And now the king here is fasting on behalf of Daniel. No entertainment was brought before him. He was unable to sleep. So the conspiracy seems to have worked. And since we're going to be cutting off the narrative here until the next time, it's kind of a cliffhanger, isn't it? Daniel's in the lion's den. The king is fasting. He couldn't do anything about it legally, but he's fasting now, hoping that Daniel will be okay. And of course, the king has heard about all of these things. He heard, there's no doubt that he's heard about Daniel's 3 friends who were saved by God from the fiery furnace. He's aware that some really powerful things happen when these people put their trust in the one true God. So what do we know about Daniel's emotional state? Not much. I mentioned that before. But it does say that he just went about his business. And again, he was filled with God's Spirit. He was filled with that fearlessness as well. And the same thing was true about his 3 friends as well before they were thrown into the fiery furnace. They showed complete courage in the Lord. And something like that doesn't happen unless it's by God's Spirit. What do we know about Darius' emotional state? Well, he was in a panic. This was his top official, who he respected. So the lion's mouth and the Brit Hadashah, 2 Timothy 4:16. At my defense, this is Paul speaking, at my defense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me. I'm just relating this to what Daniel's going through at this point too. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me in order that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all of the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people of the nations, might hear. And I was delivered out of the lion's mouth. Interesting wording by Paul. It seems to be an expression at this point of either conspiratorial behavior of people around us, or just people forsaking us, not standing by us when we need them the most. But that's the wording that Paul used, delivered out of the lion's mouth, when he was completely abandoned. So at times, we can expect these kinds of things to happen to us as well. Maybe not something as dramatic as being thrown into a lion's den, but maybe. And so we want to be ready. We want to know that God is bigger than any of this, that God can deliver us from whatever challenges and whatever circumstances that we face. So we're going to end it there at this point. Daniel, this was only part 1 of chapter 6. We're going to pick it up next week with part 2. And we'll finish the chapter, God willing, next week. Let's stand. Let's stand together. And we'll have the worship team come up as well. Thank you. Avinu Shabbat Shamayim, our Father who is in heaven, Lord, when challenges to our faith and our service to you is opposed and challenged in various ways, please strengthen our faith to be like Daniel, unfazed and trusting that you will work out your purposes in our lives, trusting that you are able to deliver us from the lion's mouth or any other obstacles and challenges in our lives. In Hebrews chapter 11, you remind us that without faith it is impossible to please you. For the one who comes to you must believe that you reward those who seek you. And by faith Noah and his family were saved. By faith Abraham left his father's land to sojourn in a land of promise. And by faith he bound his son Isaac. By faith Moses was hidden from Pharaoh by his sister. And by faith Israel walked through the sea on dry ground. By faith our heroes, they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, and shut the mouths of lions. May our faith be strengthened by your Spirit working within us and by the joyful study of your word. In Psalm 119, great peace have they who love your Torah. Nothing can make them stumble. Instead, we are strengthened and equipped to face every challenge. And Lord, right now we put our trust in you. And we rely on your Holy Spirit, we rely on your strength, and we turn our hearts to you. And we pray these things in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.